At the start of May, I sat down for a conversation with historians Jon Meacham and Jill Lepore. The conversation was titled Lessons from History, and it came at a time when a lot was happening in U.S. politics.
The armed man accused of opening fire outside the security checkpoint at the White House Correspondents Dinner is in custody and expected in court tomorrow.
The U.S. Supreme Court today struck down one of Louisiana's majority black congressional districts, a decision that weakens key protections under the Voting Rights Act.
But we do begin with the war against Iran, with gas prices moving higher yet again, and the president's allies trying to buy him more time to end the conflict and avoid a messy showdown with Congress.
It also came at a notable time for Jill Lepore. Just 3 days after our conversation, this year's Pulitzer Prize winners were announced.
And the Pulitzer Prize goes to We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution by Jill Lepore.
Jon Meacham won a Pulitzer Prize back in 2009. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Khalilah Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about history and our current political moment. This event was the final discussion of the Connecticut Forum's 34th season. It included our live conversation and an opportunity for the panelists to meet with local high school students. We enjoyed hearing from these award-winning historians so much that we decided to extend the conversation to 2 episodes. So if you love what you hear today, you can hear even more next week. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University and Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She's also a staff writer for The New Yorker and a best-selling author. Her books include These Truths, A History of the United States, and We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. Jon Meacham is Distinguished Visiting Professor at Vanderbilt University. His best-selling books include And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. I opened with a question about the title of the event, Lessons from History. I asked our panelists what comes to mind for them when they hear that title. Jill started us off.
I feel so defeatist already because I'm not really a big believer in lessons from history. I have, the way I like to think about this, I have this amazing colleague, the Shakespeare scholar, Stephen Greenblatt. And he does this incredible exercise at the beginning of freshman year with students where he tells a story. I had a terrible unexplained illness this summer. And I've been just out of it all summer, not getting any work done, not feeling well. It was very difficult to diagnose, but I repeatedly went to the best medical specialists, the best medical care here in Boston, and I saw the cutting edge experts in this condition, and it was finally diagnosed. I studied the Renaissance, I studied the 16th century, but of course I would need the best 21st century medical care. But if I wanted to learn about suffering from a disease, I could read something that was written in 4000 BC. If I wanted to see art or read a poem that expressed how difficult it is to wrestle with an illness, I could look at something that was painted in a cave wall 40,000 years ago. I could read a poem that was written yesterday, a poem that is written 10,000 years from now. That humanistic knowledge is timeless because humans are just humans. We are always humans. This is a lecture he gives about what is the humanities? What is the study of humanity? And this is a kind of a contest of ideas for historians. Some historians think of history as a discipline that is a discipline within the humanities. And others think of it as a social science, right? So social science is about predicting the future, learning from the past, discovering patterns. And I'm a humanist. I don't really think there are lessons from the past because people as people don't actually get better or worse.
Jon, let me ask you if there are
one lesson is don't have Jill speak first. That is a lesson from history.
I disagree.
Tell me why. Sort of.
John and I are committed to disagreeing this evening
Yes.
to model civic dialogue.
My friend Khalilah, who wrote Thelma and Louise, she's a Nashville friend. She and I want to start a podcast called Bad Marriage. We don't actually have them, but if we were married to each other, we would. That's the premise of the marriage. So, of course it's humanities. It's not a social science, I don't think. There's not a predictive quality except insofar as stories, cave paintings, scripture is predictive. It seems to me if you don't believe that history can teach you something, then you are unilaterally disarming in the battles of the present, because at that point you're treating every day, to stay in our Shakespearean thing, as if you're Miranda in The Tempest, right? Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Remember her father says, "'Tis new to thee," one of the great sidelines of all time. The only data set we have in human affairs is history. So if we don't remember where we were, if we don't remember what we honor and what we want to avoid, then I don't quite see how we constructively govern ourselves to create the next chapter. I go back to the great Lyndon Johnson story about, he brought George Wallace up after Bloody Sunday. Dick Goodwin tells the story, and Johnson had deep sofa cushions in the Oval Office couches so that the visitor would sink. And he had his rocking chair built a little higher so he would loom. And he puts Wallace on the couch and he leans over and he says, "George, what do you want them to think about you when you're gone? Do you want your grave to be this scrawny pine wood thing that says George Wallace he hated? Or do you want it to be a mighty marble monument that says George Wallace he built?" And to me, that's a lesson from history, how you want history to see you.
So is it that history doesn't have lessons, or that we can't learn from that? Or do we get it wrong when we define what is history? So is it less about what history is supposed to do and more about what constitutes history? Because that idea of your personal history, your personal narrative, is quite different from this moment that I think we all find ourselves in, of trying to figure out what is actually happening and where do we go to make sense of this moment. Are we just misunderstanding what history actually is?
I don't think so. I mean, a lot of people are. There's one in particular.
Who would that be? Who would that be, John?
Can't think of who it was.
Okay. We'll come back to that.
Yeah. I'm going to build an arch outside. So there's that. History is Jill's written about this wonderfully. It's a contested arena, of course, but I would argue that the way to judge that history is being manipulated for the powerful of the moment, is to know history itself, right? So, again, I don't think we have to get lost in, what would John Tyler do about Social Security? I do like to think about that kind of thing, but that's why no one hangs out with me. So it's not that, and it's not just finding an analogy for everything, but I don't see how we can be citizens of a republic in which empathy and our moral capacity to delay our own gratification is the oxygen of the experiment. And the fact that you have to clap is a bad sign, right? So democracy is give and take. And it's a lot more fun to take than to give. That's been true since the second chapter of Genesis. There was a piece of fruit. We were told not to take it. We took it. Mayhem ensues. So democracy is a republic, is a remarkably difficult, counterintuitive undertaking to delay our own appetites and ambitions, and to treat politics not as an arena for total war, but as an arena of contention, where we can have rivals and opponents, but we can't have enemies. Because then you're into Thomas Hobbes, right? Then you're in a constant war. That's what I think the predominant political power in the country, and I say predominant not because it's a majority, but because it has the means under their control. They want this to be a constant war. They want politics to be an enveloping drama in which you do not have rivals and opponents who are worthy of respect. You have enemies to be destroyed. And that's autocracy. That's not democracy. And just to tie this up, and I'm able to say that, I think, because I've read a lot of history. So, I think.
Jill, let me bring you in again. Is it about our definition of history or our expectation of what we think history can do in these moments?
I think there are a lot of different ways of thinking about the world that travel under the name of history. And some of them are ways of thinking that I find profoundly meaningful and important, full of enrichment and enlightenment and solace that richly reward our study. And some of them I find to be rather less useful and unfamiliar to me as a mode of historical thinking. So I don't mean to suggest that there are a million reasons to study history. It's what I do. I really,
You're not a geologist.
I really believe in this. But it's closer to me to the study of literature than to the study of economics, say. That's the distinction that I was trying to make. And I entirely agree, right? We can understand political systems better comparatively. And we could compare them across space and we can compare them across time. Right? So we can think about the current state of democracy in the United States in 2026, and we might compare it with democracies around the world, or we might compare it with democracies in times past. And both of those approaches will be edifying. We will learn a great deal. And even if you think about, I'll give a counter-argument to my own position, which you think about James Madison in the 1780s preparing for, what becomes the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, like the other hardworking delegates to that convention, not all of them were hardworking, but those who were, they studied history. That's how they prepared for the convention, right? Madison keeps this list of the vices and virtues of every republic ever attempted, right? He's writing back to his father, borrowing money to buy books, because he feels he needs to do a complete survey of every attempt to found a republican form of government and what went wrong. And that mentality, actually, the idea that to be a good statesman, you need to study history, right? That, for most of the history of the West, that has been the prevailing assumption, right? That the study of history is how you prepare for a career in politics, say. And it's absolutely the case that the diminishment of that commitment has been to our peril, right? We would have better informed elected officials if they had a sense of humility about the errors of the past. So I think we entirely agree there. For me, that is not a reason that I study history, because I'm not chiefly interested in politics, even though I write about it a lot. So I'm not really chiefly interested in the lessons of the errors of past statesmen for our current statesmen, which is a really important way to study history. It's not what gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm fascinated by the experience of ordinary people, their suffering, how they contend with suffering. I remember one day in 2009, I reported on the Tea Party movement for The New Yorker. And I kind of pitched it just because this movement had just started, and there was a Boston chapter, and it was the Boston Tea Party. And I just thought that was so great. I was like, that's just great. There are people who are meeting, and they were meeting in the Green Dragon Tavern, which is where the Sons of Liberty met. And so I would teach my class on the American Revolution, and I would bike across the river into Boston, and I would go hang out with the people at the Green Tavern who were dressed up as the Sons of Liberty. And they would say things like, I just wish I lived in the 18th century.
I don't.
I know.
Not me.
Right.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Right. And I'm like,
I would have been fine.
Me not so much.
But the thing is, and I would say, Did you not? You know, you would want to kill yourself if you had a toothache. There is no relief of pain. Your children would die in infancy. Your wife would die in childbirth. You would be condemned to a life of unfreedom. Almost everybody had some form of unfreedom, whether, even if you're, inheriting wealth, you're waiting for it. Like you're the property of your parent. Like, there's just no part of me that wants to live in the 18th century. Those people thought that they thought there were many lessons to be learned from history. They were very passionate about it, and I really respected and admired that in them. But it was a kind of folklore that many people cherish, and I find politically extremely dangerous. And I think that's in a way when I kind of balk a little bit, or what are the lessons of history, it's very common for people with a political agenda to go fishing in the past with their fishing pole and just pull out with the fish that they want to justify their political position. It is an ocean of knowledge. You can't just pick and choose what advances your political argument. That's the world that we live in, and I think that's often what people think history is. And so, I work both as a journalist and as a professor. We both do. And it's always fascinating to me, the journalistic question was, can you give me something that will help me make this case? And it's like, no, I can't. That's a defiance of the historical method. Like, I can go try to find out. I can answer a question for you. We could talk about what your own research strategy could be, but I don't provide evidence. I'm not an advocate. Right. I think history as advocacy has been quite damaging to our sense of political community. So these are some of the sources of my reticence, which makes me sound like a crank, when in fact I love thinking about the past and I love thinking about its relationship to the present, but I also think it's ethically quite a fraught thing to do.
Coming up, more with Pulitzer Prize winning historians Jill Lepore and Jon Meacham. Jon talks about not giving up on the experiment that is United States democracy.
I find it both thrilling and terrifying that one of the things history and human experience tells us is that this is up to us.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Khalilah Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with two Pulitzer Prize winning historians about what history can and cannot tell us about the current political moment. We're still joined by Harvard professor, New Yorker writer, and best-selling author Jill Lepore. We're also still joined by best-selling author and visiting professor at Vanderbilt, Jon Meacham. Here's more of our conversation. It was recorded live in May at the Connecticut Forum.
As the resident political scientist on the stage, where the minute I tell someone, I try not to tell them what I do, but the minute I tell them I'm a political scientist, they want me to explain everything to them and help them figure out how to get out of whatever mess they find themselves into. There is a word that I loathe right now, and that word is unprecedented.
Oh, yeah.
Anyone else? All right.
Yeah.
Everything is unprecedented to the point where, well, what does that actually mean? And yet, if we think about the last 7 days in this country, another assassination attempt, a gutting of the Voting Rights Act, I didn't even want to drive here today because gas is $18 a gallon. It feels really unprecedented. It feels overwhelming. And so people, I think, are looking to historians or looking to political scientists to help them feel some kind of center of, is it really unprecedented or does it just feel bad right now? How do you make sense of that? That idea that people do look to you to help us understand or to give us a moment from the past that feels relevant. And what you're saying, I think, Jon, you said this earlier, the past isn't a GPS that can magically point you to where you need to go.
Nor is it Ativan. And that's important.
Damn!
I know.
That's how I use it!
That's what we went in for. I used to think it was Jack Daniels, but, But that's not what history's for. It's not a bedtime story. It's not an antidepressant. And look, I get hit with this, never, of course, from my colleague here, but I believe starting in 2015 to 2020 that it was a terrible era, but a recognizable one. I could sort of say, okay, that's a little Huey Long there, that's a little George Wallace there. I at least get it. Then came the 2020 election and the unfolding insurrection. It wasn't just January 6th. It was the attempt to steal a full, free, and fair election. And that introduced a virus into the body politic that's going to be very, very hard to get out. That was unprecedented. Andrew Jackson didn't do it in 1824. Richard Nixon did it in 1960. Hubert Humphrey didn't do it in 1968. Al Gore didn't do it in 2000. This was different. But it's not really our job to say, oh, it's all going to be okay. And sometimes I'm criticized for this because I do think ultimately, if you don't think it's going to be okay if we work hard enough, then we should all just go jump off a bridge. Or, as one of my intellectual idols said, and I don't want to dork you out too much, but you're here on a Friday night, so. Really need to re-examine your priorities. But as John Belushi said, we did not give up when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor. So we can't do that. So, I'll tell you a quick story about a very small category called great tweets. It's like French military victories in the 20th century. It doesn't take long. Someone tweeted out about a year ago that if Doris Kearns Goodwin and Mr. Rogers had had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. And, right?
How do you feel about that?
Well, I thought it was great.
I like that you're owning that, John.
I like
pretty
it.
good genes.
Well, no, I thought it was great. And then Doris learned how to use her phone, and she called me. And so it popped up. I said, Mom. She said, that's not funny. And I said, why not? She said, I don't mind being your mother, but I don't want to be a floozy. And I said, look, you thought the tennis shoe and the sweater was great, but I do believe that the only way we get out of this is if just enough of us love our neighbor, just enough. And so maybe that sounds like, but our job is not to be an antidepressant. Our job is to be an orienting, I would argue, often bracing and challenging. I find it both thrilling and terrifying that one of the things history and human experience tells us is that this is up to us. And that's thrilling because it's like, hey, it's up to us. And it's terrifying. It's like, oh, shit, it's up to us. And yes, I know about the algorithms. I know about cable news. I know about Citizens United. You don't need to bring it up. But I just declined to have, a 250-year experiment that's really only been a good experiment in a fully multiracial democracy for 60 years, right? 1965 is when we were really founded. I just declined to give up that experiment because of a social media algorithm.
So if history isn't the antidepressant, perhaps it can be the antidote to the massive widespread ignorance that we often find ourselves in, where people are asking, what really is the role of that? I want to bring in a question from a group of young people who are definitely countering ignorance. They were really tough on us earlier. They had amazing, nuanced questions that basically boiled down to, why can't you adults get it together? Right? I asked myself as well. So here's a question from one of the students, and I think it follows on what you just said, John. You both have written extensively about the history of the Constitution as well as the Supreme Court. Do you believe the court has become more powerful than the founders originally intended?
I'm happy to answer that, having just written a very, very, very long book about the history of the Constitution. So the court is more powerful than the framers of the Constitution of 1787 intended, and that they granted as powers delineated in the Constitution. But it has been that much more powerful since 1803. It's not a new power. I think it's important to remember that what's relatively new in American history is the decreased power of Congress. Congress was always understood to be and intended to be the most powerful branch of the government. And the increased power of the executive, which is really a 20th century development. So it's actually very difficult to just consider the Supreme Court in isolation because really its power is relative to what other powers. I think it's also important to remember that there's a very consistent pattern across American history that dates back to the early 19th century, which is that the people who are complaining about the power of the Supreme Court are confronted by a court staffed with justices that they don't agree with. And then once a different group of justices assume power on the Supreme Court, suddenly those people think the Supreme Court ought to have that power, and the people who used to think they should have that power. So there's really, it's sad to say, it seems very cynical, but there's not any really principled position with regard to judicial supremacy in the United States, and there never has been. There are not commentators that you can look to, and having spent years writing about this and thinking about this, I kept thinking I would find a Supreme Court commentator who was really consistent across. So as a liberal, really loved the liberal court, said it was great that the liberal court had all this power, the Supreme Court should have all this power, and then once the court became conservative, still thought it was great that the Supreme Court had that power. I just really haven't found that commentator.
Yeah. Everybody's against executive power until they have it, right? I mean, Jefferson bought Louisiana in a way that if Hamilton had tried to do it, he would have his head would have exploded. But he did it.
Let me ask you, John, another question from a student named John. Compared to other nations throughout history, what stage do you think we find ourselves in the lifespan of our country?
Hell, I don't know. I mean, I think the founders would be somewhat surprised we'd made it this far. Mm-hmm. Honestly, certainly with that number of amendments. And so, third centuries aren't great for popular governments, but our capacity, usually after, as Churchill said, we've exhausted every other possibility, our capacity to amend and more fully apply the implications of the most important sentence, I would argue, ever originally rendered in English, that all men are created equal. We have just managed to do enough in the right direction to keep the experiment going. And it's often been like this. Now, some of you may think that's hyperbolic, the most important sentence ever originally rendered in English. It's a little like the story about the Texas school board candidate who was against teaching Spanish in the public schools and said on the stump one day, if English was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for Texas. Always liked that story. I told George W. Bush that when he was governor. He said, he said, that's pretty funny. So, we're very close. I think if enough of us decide that the experiment is worth continuing, even when we lose a round, right? So what we've learned in the last 5 years, 6 years now, is democracy depends on the capacity to win graciously and to lose graciously. Without that, it doesn't work. So I think this is a moral crisis. By moral, I mean how we are with each other. We were talking earlier about the unwritten parts of the Constitution. There are some things we don't do simply because we don't do them, because they're not to be done. And we have learned anew in the last decade how tenuous and fragile that can be. Because what if someone says, I'm going to do it anyway?
Coming up, more with Pulitzer Prize winning historians Jill Lepore and Jon Meacham. Jill describes how she sees the relationship between our current politics and our understanding of the past.
We do centrally have two different myths of American history.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Khalilah Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with Pulitzer Prize winning historians about lessons from the past. We're still joined by Harvard University professor Jill Lepore. She's author of We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. And visiting professor at Vanderbilt University, Jon Meacham, author of American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. Here's more of our conversation.
So many people are talking about America 250, what that means, what it should mean, and what it means in practice. And as I think about all of the conversations and the commemorations, it also reminds me of the power of myths in how we think about history, how we romanticize certain eras, how we overlook the resistance that people encountered, and how, John, you've talked about how writing the Declaration of Independence wasn't thought of as this grand sweeping thing at the time, but really translating common sense into what could live on. What then is the power of myth making today when we think about history and when we think about these moments of conflict, of how we win graciously, we lose graciously, and we don't try to burn it all down because we don't like the outcome? How do myths play a role in that?
Well, I think we could spend some time remembering, given that we have John's constituency in the audience, the bicentennial, which we were all around for, as a really important moment in telling a story about the country. That was quite a fraught moment, and I think we tend to forget how fraught that moment was. So, July 4th, 1976 was a fun day. There were fireworks in the mall. Gerald and Betty Ford stood in the White House and looked out over at the monument, and it was a kind of glorious moment and a day. But that was at the culmination of a vast amount of controversy over whether even to celebrate the nation's 200th anniversary. That's not dissimilar to the controversy today, with some very big notable exceptions. But think about 1965 in the Voting Rights Act was passed. It was the centennial of the anniversary of the end of the Civil War, which was a really fraught moment in the United States at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, to both celebrate the Voting Rights Act and the recent passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but also look back to the Civil War and think about, whether or not the reckoning with that war had ever happened. Would it ever happen? And it's at that moment that Johnson decides to form a bicentennial commission that's going to be celebrating the bicentennial of the country. We're going to kind of just set aside, the Civil War anniversary kind of came and went, but we're going to look forward to celebrating the American Revolution. That he felt there was a need for a new and unified story of the country. He appoints this quite impressive commission to start preparing for the bicentennial. But they're going to start right away, because their bicentennial is going to be 10 years. They're going to start with the Stamp Act Congress anniversary in 1966, and it's going to go all the way to 1976. We're going to be celebrating this thing for 10 years straight. And then when Johnson steps down and Nixon wins the 1968 election, Nixon fires the whole commission and appoints a bunch of Republicans no, we're going to celebrate me and celebrate the Republican Party. And by the time you get to Nixon's resignation in 74, the commission has been dismantled twice. We've had Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers, Watergate. Now we have Nixon's resignation. And you go around, there's incredible Vox Pop documentary footage of going around just asking ordinary Americans in 74, 75, 76, what is there to celebrate? Is the country just a myth at this point? And everyone in their bell bottoms and beads and beards is yeah, man, it sucks here now. It's kind of just great. It's it is a bit of Ativan, honestly, to watch this documentary footage, because people are I don't know. We have inflation. Gas is really expensive right now. We've never got past the divisions of the Vietnam War. There's just a lot of kind of I don't know. But then when the actual thing happens, the guy that Gerald Ford ends up replacing as they have a bicentennial administration instead, and this guy, John Warner, says, you know what? Let's just throw money at the states. Like, let's not do anything really as a federal government. It's not for us to say what so they just give out huge grants. Like 2/3 of historic houses, museums in this country were funded or founded by federal government money during the bicentennial. Let's just let towns, city neighborhoods, states tell their own stories, have their own celebrations. And so people do all, there's like a bike race in Boulder, and there's like a ping pong match in New Hampshire. Like, people just do their stuff. And so I bet people in this audience remember really different things that they did in the 1970s to celebrate the bicentennial. I had to dress up like a cookie for a Girl Scout parade. I had to stitch a mob cap. My brother got to carry a musket that had real cap gun firing in it. Like, we all did our own thing, and largely it was with money that was devolved from the federal government, because Ford just had this idea, like, let's just not. And it ended up being a way that different communities found their way to their own stories. And maybe their story was, we're really unhappy with where this country is right now. And maybe that story was, this country hasn't been as good to my ancestors as it has been to your ancestors. Or maybe that story was, I just love everything about America. But that people did these things, and they did them, and they enjoyed one another, and they had the capacity to tolerate that there were many different ways of doing it. What's different about, that could still happen this year in 2026, right? People, I think, probably everybody in this room has a plan for July 4th already. It's kind of a big one. What are you doing? Where are you going? Who are you doing it with? But I don't think we're all sitting around waiting for the federal government to tell us, but the federal government is very determined to tell us what to do. And that is very different from the bicentennial. That the federal government is quite determined to be the promulgator of what the myth is that we are all supposed to be honoring in this moment. And I think that's extremely dangerous.
Can we go back to the cookie?
Well, I was hoping that a picture would come up.
What kind of cookie?
We were Girl Scouts, so we got to be...
Were you a Thin Mint?
No. I think it was the peanut butter one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was really waiting for a picture.
Yeah.
I was hoping we could
Don't you
get
think?
one. Maybe we
John,
could
what did you
archive.
guys do for the bicentennial? You're too young.
You're too young.
I was born that year.
You're bicentennial baby.
A bicentennial baby.
There you go.
Big birthday this year.
It was really hot. I remember that. I think we played baseball. So I grew up on a Civil War battlefield that only had Union monuments because the Union had won, and they only people who had money. And so it was Missionary Ridge. And we would pretend that the cannons, which were Civil War cannons, had been Revolutionary cannons. So we were more militaristic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a way to grow up.
I didn't dress up like a cookie.
We ask a question in a different way. I'm stuck on the cookie and the musket and the Civil War repurposing of cannons. I'll get over it. But I am curious.
You're young.
I've got time. Because some of these myths, right, the stories that we tell ourselves are harmless. It's just sort of a nature of memory. But then there are some ways that these myths actually become dangerous, either because they can help provoke people into a response of feeling like, now you don't want me to tell my history, and so now I have to defend that because I'm fearful. Or it overlooks what people really risk and what they have to do in order to make history. Let me give you the example. So many people think that Rosa Parks was just this exhausted seamstress who one day said, I just cannot move on this bus because I'm so tired. And they don't think of her as a professional woman who was an organizer and a strategist. They don't think about, we need the Rosa Parks and not the Claudette Colvin because that's going to be too risky when we tell the history of what change actually looked like. And that can become damaging. Are there particular myths when we think about U.S. history or American history that you say we really need to correct the record in order to have a better sense of how these things actually play out? Is there one that sticks out to you?
Myths are hugely important. And myths is a fancy word for saying the story we tell ourselves. We all have a story about our lives that we tell ourselves constantly. A nation is the same way. One of the most interesting lines in the speech that the Canadian Prime Minister gave a month ago was that we had decided to abandon an 80-year-old fiction that we could count on America. And when he said fiction, he really meant myth. He meant expectation. You know, a story, and it doesn't have to be hugely common, I mean, it doesn't have to be common to everyone, but there has to be an overarching narrative. And I think that the best way to fight back against authoritarian narratives is to tell democratic ones. The moment, I think if we argued in the 20th century at least, what's the greatest thing the United States did? Arguably the Second World War. We produce an immense amount of material, helps unleash important social movements. We go across the seas, we help defeat fascism and tyranny. Tom Hanks was once asked why he kept making movies about World War II, and he said it was good versus evil and Grandpa won. But here's the myth of that. We didn't wake up with this PBS frontline footage of marching Nazis and say, we got to stop that. Let's organize. Okay? From September 1st, 1939, until December the 8th, 1941, we let other people stand in the breach, chiefly Great Britain. Even then, when did we declare war on Nazi Germany? 5 days after that. Why? Because Hitler declared war on us. Franklin Roosevelt did not declare war, did not send a declaration of war to Congress on Sunday, December 7th, Monday the 8th, Tuesday the 9th, Wednesday the 10th, Thursday the 11th. On Thursday the 11th, Hitler, in one of the mistakes from which he would never recover, declares war on us. We were dragged kicking and screaming into what we now think of as the great defining struggle of modernity in many ways. I mean, in a series of events that ends up with the capacity to end humankind, with the splitting of the atom, that gets to rank up there. So I think it's important to tell that story, not so that we can self-righteously look down at the past and say, oh, well, we certainly would have been with Dean Acheson and the interventionists, you know, we would have seen the threat and acted. White Southerners of my generation, I was born 4 years after Selma, we all think we would have been on the bridge and not at the foot of the bridge with the possemen and the troopers. But guess what? If everybody who thinks they would have been on the bridge had been on the bridge, they wouldn't have had to be on the bridge. Right? So Arthur Schlesinger used to say that self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. And so I'm not diminishing what the decision makers and the polity of the Second World War. What I'm saying is that if even the best thing that we did could be touch and go and contingent, let's take strength from that. And let's realize that we can do big things, but we don't have to be perfect. And if perfection's the goal, we're not going to make it. We're a 51-49 country, not just in polling. I know that if I do the right thing 51% of the time, that's a hell of a good day. And I don't have many of those. And don't get cocky, but I doubt y'all do either.
How's today going for you?
I'm feeling great about today.
I think I have a slightly different view about myth. What I like about your answer is the degree to which it's important to be willing to be unsettled by the facts of the historical record. And I think that does distinguish historical research as a mode of inquiry and study from myth, which has its place. I think what's really challenging about our 51-49 American life right now is that we do centrally have two different myths of American history. And one is that everything that the United States has ever done at home and abroad has been part of a march of freedom, prosperity, and progress. The United States has never done anything wrong. This is one mythical account. And the other mythical account is everything that the United States has ever done at home and abroad has been an act of atrocity. American history is a litany of atrocity and misdeeds at home and abroad, and the United States has never done anything right. And those myths of American history map on, of course, perfectly to political extremism on the right and on the left. And I think they're quite dearly held. And it is a huge problem for our ability to gather together as citizens in communities and talk about how are we going to fund the playground in our neighborhood when we have these irreconcilable accounts of the American past. There's, of course, truth in both of those accounts. There's a lot of atrocity in American history. There's a lot of progress and freedom and prosperity, too. And if you can't see that both of those things can be true, you actually can't come together really about anything. And, the antebellum agitators before the Civil War talked about the irreconcilable conflict, the irrepressible conflict. And there's something so entrenched about those two political myths. And I think a way to help think about whether you have kind of succumbed to myth-making in place of history is to ask whether your account of American history conveniently maps onto your understanding of politics. And if it does, that's a problem.
That was Jill Lepore, professor of American history at Harvard University. She's staff writer for The New Yorker and best-selling author. Her book, We the People, A History of the United States Constitution, just won a Pulitzer Prize. Jon Meacham is Distinguished Visiting Professor at Vanderbilt University. His best-selling books include And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. This episode is the first of 2 episodes featuring my live Connecticut Forum conversation with Jill and Jon. You can tune in next week to hear more of our conversation.
If you are not part of the authoritarian, predominant power in the country today, you cannot give up on the idea, the possibilities of America being great.
The progressives of the Democratic Party since the era of Clinton-Gore have, on the whole, failed to deliver the kinds of progressive reforms that were promised.
That's next week on Disrupted. Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, and Erica McIntosh. Meg Fitzgerald is our Senior Manager of Projects and Radio Programming. Special thanks to the Connecticut Forum. And a note for our listeners, Connecticut Forum is a current sponsor of Connecticut Public. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive, and you can find us wherever you get your podcast. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Khalilah Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.